All right. Hello and welcome everybody to our first IMPLAN webinar of 2026. Thank you all for signing up and attending. It looks like we have a great group here already, 80 and rising. So thank you all. We're really excited to have you here. I'm very happy to introduce Nadège Ngomsi, our Education Services Specialist. Today, she's going to be talking to us about the power of forward linkages, and she has some very exciting use cases in mind that she is going to demonstrate. I think that this is a great presentation of the capabilities of our forward linkages suite and some of the opportunities of how to use this. So without any further ado, I am going to let Nadège take center stage.
And thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on turning data into dollars. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question Q&A chat. Eric will be helping me to field those questions for our live Q&A later. Thank you. Okay, so even though Forward Linkages is its own separate package, it's still just as important as ever before. And because Forward Linkages is no longer just a new feature in our toolkit, it's a line item now in our budget. So my goal today is to ensure that this tool doesn't just sit on the shelf for you guys. I want to show you how to make it earn its reputation by solving impossible client problems. And so today we're going to move past simple data entry into the realm of advanced strategic foresight. So today I'm going to walk you through three specific playbooks that will transform standard economic reports into these high stakes business intelligence reports. So by the end of this hour, you won't just be using forward linkages, you'll also be incorporating it into your daily routine. Okay, so today what's on the menu today is first our welcome, which we've already done, our forward linkage recap. I'm just going to recap what forward linkage actually is and how you can use it in IMPLAN. We're also going to meet our three clients that we'll be demoing. We're going to be demoing three client solutions, ways that you can use forward linkages for your own benefit, as well as a live Q&A, followed by our live Q&A. Okay, so let's dive into what forward linkages actually is. So most of us are looking at the supply chain, and when we look at the supply chain, we typically look at it backwards. So take, for example, baking a cake. We see the cake as the final product, and so we're looking at the recipe, we're looking at the ingredients, we're looking backward into the supply chain to figure out what ingredients constitute a cake. So we have flour, we have the eggs, we have the sugar. Think of those as the commodities that are utilized to create and bake this cake. But forward linkages, we're actually looking forward. So we're using the exact same supply chain structure, but we're standing at the other end of the counter. We're no longer looking to buy the cake. We're no longer the cake. We're the flour. And we're looking at the product and we're saying, okay, now that this has left the kitchen, what other recipes am I part of? So rather than looking backward in the supply chain, we're actually looking forward in the supply chain. IMPLAN has two guides that can help us model these different scenarios using forward linkages. The first guide is the Downstream Contribution Guide. It is our volume map. And so this is asking the question, who else is using our ingredient? It tracks the flow of goods. It shows us exactly which industries downstream are powered by our production process. And then our second guide is the cost push guide. We typically also will call it the price change guide, because this is what happens if the price of this commodity were to spike or even if it were to drop. And so we're here to model this cost push guide, typically models some form of a price shock. So it could be inflation, it can be a tariff, or a tax. And it shows how a change in your price ripples throughout everyone else's recipe. Okay, so before we meet our clients, let's take a poll. We want to know, do you currently have a use case for forward linkages? couple people are unsure, and that's okay. Hopefully, by the end of this webinar, you will have a use case for forward linkages. Oh, okay. Okay. So most of you are still unsure. Some of you don't have a use case yet, and some of you do. Okay, that's a good mix of people. Great. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to our demoing our client solutions. Okay, so let's meet our three clients who need our help. So Alex in Florida, he is a VP of Operations and Innovation. He's investing $100 million in green technology in hopes that it will lower production costs by 15%. So he wants to know if his strategy investment will provide a return on his investment. So will the $100 million in green technology, will that prove a return on his investment and lower those production costs? So our next client is Emily in Michigan, and she's an environmental, social, and governance director. And she needs to secure a massive grant by proving that her factory will cause other processes to become more green, like a supply chain reaction. And so she wants to know if her solvent, her green solvents, her chemicals will make other industries or other industries more green in the process. And then we have Dave in Indiana. And so Dave is a government expert, and he needs to prove that a provincial tariff on steel imposed by Canada will not only affect Illinois, but it will also have spillover effects in Indiana. Okay, so now that we're going to go over each client's problems, we're going to see how we can solve these complex client circumstances using forward linkages. Okay, so our first client is Alex, and let's pretend that I'm the official IMPLAN therapist at the IMPLAN Lounge, and I'm listening to these client problems as they sit on this Freudian psychoanalytic couch to share their anxieties. And so Alex sounded pretty anxious when he called in. Let's hear what he has to say. I've got a game-changing technology that cuts our Florida's plant costs by 15%. But my CFO, he's tighter than a new pair of boots on a humid day. He says, that's great for our margins, Alex, but how does it help the Sunshine State? I need to prove that my 15% cost reduction is actually savings for every local Florida business that buys from us. Help me calculate the regional return on investment so I can get this grant approved. Okay, so we have two choices to model Alex's circumstance. The most accurate way to model his particular circumstance, though, is not with the downstream contribution guide, but actually with the cost push guide. Remember, think of cost push as like a price change. Typically, changes in tariffs and inflation, they're measured in percentages, but a percentage change is just a price change. So it's just a change in price. Okay, so this is the way to demo Alex's circumstance. First, when you enter the guide, you'll be asked if you want to, which region you'd like to select, if it's US total or subnational US region. We're going to select Florida, and then you're going to also select your commodity. I'm not sure if you can read that, but Alex selected other basic organic chemicals. So, and that is in plan code 155. And so your commodity, you can either select before and after prices, or you can also select a percent change in price. So we're going to do the percent change in price. But because this typically models cost saving and or cost instead of cost saving, we're actually going to put a negative here. So this negative 15% shows us the difference between the cost saving rather than a cost incurement. This is the return on investment. Okay. So this is also an overview slide. After you push in your percentage, you input the percentage. This overview is kind of the final confirmation screen before generating the results. It shows us that there will be a $314 million cost reduction. And this negative number, it represents the money going in to the pockets of Florida's industrial base. So it's making every recipe, every commodity in that state cheaper to make. And this is just, again, the overview slide. It tells us exactly what our dollar year is, what Florida, what region we selected, and what our commodity is. So we see that it's 3155 other basic organic chemicals. Okay. And here are our results slide. So we'll see here that IMPLAN will give us the price change cost impacts. Notice that the negative signs in the results, this is the negative cost impact. And this is actually good news. This is showing us that the $314 million is actually a cost saving. And this $7.5 million is the direct price break to Florida manufacturers every year. And the $3.9 million that you see here, this is the ripple effect in the annual saving to the supply chain due to the lower chemical prices that trickle down. So Alex was able to prove to the CFO that the $100 million investment will actually decrease the cost of production for other chemicals. Okay, so now let's move on to client number 2. So Emily, our ESG director, and when Emily visited the IMPLAN lounge, she kind of sounded a bit nervous. Her nerves were getting to her. So what did Emily actually have to say? The grant committee loves that our factory is carbon neutral, but they keep asking about scope 3. They want to know if we give you this $100 million, which other industries will become greener because of you? I need to prove our green solvents are flowing into high polluting sectors like plastics and automotive. Give me a report that proves we are the green link for Michigan's industrial heartland. So what does Emily really want to prove here? She actually just wants to prove if she were to receive the grant, how much more green friendly were are these chemical products? How much more green activity further down the supply chain can she produce? But she needs to prove this to the grant committee. So let's go ahead and demo Emily's circumstance. But before we can demo, we want to know, since she wants to know how her process will affect other industries further down the supply chain, is it going to be cost push or downstream? Well, since I used the word further down, most likely downstream. So we're going to utilize a downstream industry contribution analysis. So IMPLAN actually has a really wonderful article on scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Emily's situation is actually pretty common, but before I can begin to demo it, I just want to give you a recap of scope 1, 2, 3. Remember and recall that scope 1 is our direct emissions. This is the actual pollution that that Emily's work site will be utilizing. So pollution that comes directly from the things that she's actually producing. Scope 2, on the other hand, is the indirect pollution. This is caused by the energy companies. So the energy utility companies that are going to utilize Emily's project. That is the scope 2. Scope 3, on the other hand, is also indirect, but this is what Emily is actually interested in. Scope 3 is what Emily is trying to convince the grant committee for. She knows that scope 3 is difficult because it involves other people. This affects others in the supply chain. So she needs to know, will her green solvent produce other green activity further down in the supply chain? So let's model her circumstance because we haven't seen the downstream industry contribution yet. So she'll put a dollar year, and since we are using 2025 dollar year, she's just going to leave that as is. So her green chemical solvent commodity code is actually the IMPLAN code 151. And this is typically petrochemical manufacturing. So when you open the downstream contribution guide, this is a very similar interface as the cost push guide. They're going to select the NAICS code or the implant code, and then here you're actually going to put a dollar amount. Um, because she's requesting $100 million grant, she's expecting $100 million output. This is very important. She's going to put $100 million in this in the slide that states the input. And when she's putting that dollar amount, it's not a percentage. Again, IMPLAN will again provide her with that summary overview. Okay, so here are the results. After Emily runs the results in IMPLAN, she now has hard data to prove to her factory, to prove to the grant committee that her factory is the green link that will decarbonize Michigan's heavy industry. So here we see that her direct output is $100 million. This hasn't changed. These are the green petrochemicals that are flowing into the state's most critical sectors. 13.02. What does this number mean? These are the actual salary employment headcount that will be affected, that will support Emily's downstream contribution activity. And then this $28 million that you see here, this is the direct contribution to GDP. So not only is her green solvent will make everything else more green, further down in the supply chain. But look here, plastics, material, and resin manufacturing will produce take will take 10 million of her output. And then organic, other basic organic chemical manufacturing and petrochemical manufacturing are the other industries that are impacted by Emily's solvent grant. So if you can't tell already, all of these are interconnected. What Emily does in Michigan will also affect other industries downstream. And this guide enables us to see that and to show this hard data to whatever, if it's the committee, if it's to your CFO, if it's to even your team, and to show this is actually what will occur if we do this right now. This is what the future will hold for this particular activity. Now, it doesn't model the future per se, but it helps us to project and to also forecast what could happen. Okay, so let's move on to client number 3 at the IMPLAN Lounge. So Dave is a straight shooter, and he's had multiple sessions here at the IMPLAN Lounge. He's called in with a particularly interesting request. So Dave says, I'm in a political dogfight. Illinois just hiked steel costs by 20% after Canada's 20% steel tariffs. We do a lot of our trading with Illinois. I think they're trying to bankrupt my factory here in Indiana. My boss is breathing down my neck, and honestly, I'm trying to juggle porcupines in a balloon factory right now. I need a report that proves this Illinois policy is an inflation tax on Indiana manufacturing. Okay. So Dave's circumstance is a bit unique, but he wants to know what will happen to his price on steel since Illinois hiked up their steel costs by 20%. So because this is a price change, we are going to utilize the cost push guide. Okay. So the narrative has changed slightly. Dave isn't trying to prove what Illinois did. He's actually proving what happens to Indiana's own ingredient mix, or what we'll call, commodity mix. So he's showing the governor of Indiana, if this policy spreads to our state, what's the damage? He just wants to know what the damage is. So again, and since we're utilizing our cost push guide, we're going to use our percent change in price. And again, this is our overview slide. We can already see here that about $6.7 million is the cost. Now, notice that this is different to Alex. Alex modeled a negative number to show the cost saving, but this is a tariff. So Dave actually needs to model a positive number to show what the cost that he's going to incur will be. Okay, so this is our results page. Dave now can show, and these results are actually, pretty staggering. because this 20% spike is a $6.7 billion threat, actually, to the Indiana economy, particularly iron and steel and ferroalloy products, that particular industry. And also, specifically, it acts as a $1 billion direct tax on Indiana's manufacturers. So Dave was actually right. And fair warning, now all of these clients have had all of IMPLAN's Forward Linkages and has modeled all of the different ways that that they can use Forward Linkages to model their own particular scenarios. So Alex modeled it with a negative number, and he was in Florida. So he proved that $7.5 million in local savings was just the first direct effect in his obtaining that $100 million return on investment. Emily, on the other hand, modeled a positive $100 million output, and now she can prove that $10.8 million will be saved in plastics further down in the supply chain. Dave, although he inputted a positive percentage, he can now defend against a $6.7 billion inflationary policy. And so the beauty of these three clients is that although their circumstances are different, the underlying structure of the four linkage data structure is the same. So Alex modeled his scenario with the minus, again, Emily with the dollar amount, and Dave with the positive sign. Four linkages is a flexible tool and it can address many client scenarios and gives you an opportunity to see how you can contribute right now, even though you're modeling a scenario in the future. And also a client update. So far, none of our clients are in implant therapy, but we'll go ahead and keep an eye on Dave because he seems to still be calling in for other questions. But before we get to our live Q&A, we actually have one more poll for our webinar attendees. Which client pain point do you most identify with? So is it Emily, the sustainability client that wants to prove that her grant will make other suppliers greener? Is it Alex, the innovation client that wants to demonstrate his return on investment? Or is it Dave, the policy proxy client that wants to prove that that if it can happen in one region, it can happen in another region? Okay. It's seeming like Alex and Dave, many people have use cases. Many of our webinar attendees have use cases, particularly for Alex's case. And Forward Linkages is pretty popular to utilize to um, also model return on investment. That negative sign, a lot of people mainly just see it as a tariff or an inflationary tax, but the negative sign is a really good innovative trick. Okay, let's share our results. Okay, so 43% have a use case for Alex, 20% for Emily, and 37% for Dave. Thank you. Okay. And so I am actually done. Thank you guys for attending this webinar on our new wonderful package for linkages. We hope that you utilize either our cost push guide or our downstream contribution guide. Don't be afraid to try out for linkages. It's a wonderful tool. It's still brand new and shiny, but we're hoping to add on um, to the Forward Linkages framework in the future. So now we're going to open up this webinar for questions from our attendees. Eric, does any attendee have any questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Nadège, for that and for covering all our potential client use cases. Very much appreciated. And we have a great set of questions already running in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do, we have a couple that I actually answered in chat there, but I want to go ahead and bring those up too, just for everybody to hear. So
Yeah.
the first question was, assuming we have a subscription, would we be able to see the backend model or assumptions used to generate the results? And I'll go ahead and tackle this one and tell
Okay.
you that beyond the summary report that Nadège showed you here, with the guides, both the guides, you also get a more detailed output report, which is similar to what you might be used to seeing if you're not using guides for the rest of your IMPLAN analysis. It's similar to that. You'll see a little bit more detail in terms of impact by industries, chart of the top 15 industries. So more detail in the results there. Additionally, you also have access to the forward linkage multipliers. Those are through your region details and the multipliers associated with your forward linkages. Those can be found there. And then beyond that, if you're looking for general information about some of the assumptions or the broader assumptions related to the forward linkage models, I did put a link in our support site to a great forward linkage article. And you'll also find some references in that article. So depending on what you're looking for, the answer is yes, you can see more detail, both in terms of the results, and we have very clearly provided some documentation of the methodology and the assumptions that go along with the forward linkage model. The second question in that list that I already answered is, what if I'm not sure about the savings of 15% in the first example? And again, this is a very common place to find yourself, right? It's one thing to, set up a hypothetical situation and say, I know this is going to be a 15% change, but that's a little bit harder to know for certainty from from this side of things. And I will say, what we always tell everybody is that ultimately, the design of how you want to model and address that is up to you as the analyst. But you do have some options. And one that I like to think about is measuring kind of a range of changes, right? If you don't have certainty around what that change is going to be, you can set up a couple different situations, a couple of scenarios. Right? What if it's a 10% change? What if it's a 20% change? What if it's a 25% change? And one of, I think the beauty of the forward linkage guides is that doing that is not very intensive at all. It's very straightforward to set those up, and you can do that pretty quickly and easily. But again, I think you have options, in terms of how do you want to estimate and quantify that change when there's some uncertainty in it. But in
Mhm.
my opinion, ranges are one good possibility for that. Okay, now I'm going to open it up. We have another list of questions here. So thank you, everybody, for being so participatory. We love it. Let's start with the first, which is, can you do this analysis for 1 year, or can you do multiple years, both historical and future?
Yeah, so for right now, for linkages, we can only model for 1 year. So for linkages can only be modeled for a year. However, what you can do if you wanted to go back, you can go and look at previous dollar years. You're not able to actually look at like the previous year, but for right now, we can only do a year. Eric, if you want to add on to that, but
Yeah,
for our first iteration, that's, if I'm not mistaken, the only year we can do.
yeah. So you can only see the results for 1 year at a time.
Hmm.
You can go in and through the guides, you have an option to change the data year. So you can run the model for 1 year, one data year. As Nadège said, you can adjust the dollar year as well. And then you could go in and run the guide for different specification for the data year. That is only available going backwards.
Hmm.
And again, you can only run those, one at a time, going from our most current data year 2024 all the way back from there.
Mm,
Okay.
exactly.
Second question. So going back to the first example in Florida, was the company the only provider of that good in Florida? So when we were looking at this cost push change in Florida, are we saying that that's the only company there?
Um, Allison, thank you for your question. No, that's not what we're saying. We're actually just looking for the impact, how it affects the entire supply chain, but how that particular contribution, the $100 million investment, what that will do to the further supply chain. That's why we only modeled the percent change because it's only that particular percentage. So it won't affect like everyone in Florida, but it will affect that supply chain in Florida. And Eric, if you have anything else you'd like to add, please do so.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Nadège. For me, the intuition that I like to think of is that we're starting from the commodity standpoint, right? So when we were looking at this, what Nadège was starting from is a change in the price of a specific commodity that, as she so nicely put it, is part of a recipe of production for other industries. So rather than hey, this percent change in price is impacting this specific this specific company, we're saying, okay, we think there's going to be a change in price in this commodity, and people accessing that commodity for what they're producing are going to be impacted by that price change. Okay.
Exactly.
Next question. For this downstream value chain contribution, could it also be broken out by industry and region?
So at the moment, no, we can look at only one. We could either look at one state or one like US total. But for right now, this first iteration, no, it can't be broken out like by a particular industry, other than you selecting the industry which you're running the economic impact analysis on.
Yes. And I think
Thank you.
I'm not, and maybe this is not your exact question, but I do want to also reiterate, like Nadège showed, you do see in the results by industry impacts. So I'm not exactly certain if you're asking about impacts, if you can set up by industry. But you can see here, like Nadège is showing, in addition to seeing the overall direct impacts, the summary report as well as the detailed output report will show you by industry where these impacts are being felt. So uh, personally, I really like this because, again, I think it reiterates the intuition of what's happening with forward linkages, right? That we're starting from one standpoint, and we're looking forward into where that product is going or where that industry is providing things to different industries, and this kind of helps solidify that intuition. uh, let me work through a couple more questions on this list here, and then we'll see how we do with time. And I just want to add, if we don't get to all of your questions here, we will follow up. Someone will follow up and answer your questions. Let's see. It looks like there's a follow-up to the question we were just asking. This relates to if the impacts are not just restricted to a given state, but so by industry within Mississippi and again by industry within Florida, for example. So right now, I think this is what you're asking. So right now, when you set up the guide, like Nadège said, you can start either with the U.S. total, or you can start with a subnational U.S. region. But in terms of how the impacts in Mississippi might be linked to the impacts in Florida, that's not currently available in a single downstream industry contribution guide. You would have to run a separate contribution guide for Mississippi, and then again a separate contribution guide for Florida. So for those of you thinking, experienced IMPLAN users that are familiar with MRIO, that's not a capability that's available yet with forward linkages.
Oh no. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
There is another question. How I don't understand what the outcomes or results are based on. I think that's maybe a bit broad for the scope, but to give you some intuition, right? To step back to the intuition of what Nadège brought up at the beginning. Forward linkages, one of the things we like to say is that, if you look at backward linkages and forward linkages combined, it gives you kind of a 360-degree view of economic impacts. I really like that wording because when I think about what we're looking at, I think about, okay, I'm a commodity standing here. If I look backward, my traditional backward linkages, I'm looking at the supply chain that goes into my production. And I'm looking back into all the steps that it took to create where I'm at. If I'm looking forward, I'm looking the other direction at, okay, here I am. Now let's think about all of the people or industries that are going to use me as an input or are final demanders of my product. And that's what forward linkages is looking at. Right? It's saying, okay, now I have a commodity, and just like Nadège said, it's asking, okay, if something changes with the commodity, what is going to happen to all those recipes that use the commodity? Now, for more specifics, like the mathematics of what's going on and some of the theory or assumptions of what's going on, that is a little bit beyond the scope. We have a couple earlier webinars on forward linkages, which I would recommend. You can find those on our support site on the webinars page. We also have several forward linkage support site articles that dig a little bit deeper into the mathematics and, yes, how it relates to the usual IO matrices and what the difference is.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah. Okay. It looks like a couple people are curious about this. Can we demo the tracking of scope 1, 2, 3 GHG emissions within the IMPLAN tool online? I'll let you take this, Nadège.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so great question. At the moment, no. With if you're particularly thinking about forward linkages, not at the moment, no. But what it can do, though, what Emily's circumstance, what we found interesting is, although it won't be able to necessarily tell you the exact amount of the scope 3. Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. I saw someone in the chat said they couldn't hear me. Let me know if you're struggling to hear me, but it's that we get to see what the direct effect is or what the indirect effect is from the supply chains, from the industries that are affected by the scope 3. So remember, like earlier in this presentation, I started to mention that the scope 1 and scope 2, these Emily kind of already knows that this will be affected, even though scope 2 is indirect. She's really interested in scope 3. She really wants to know what other industries will be impacted if I change the way that I manufacture this particular chemical. So it won't give you that breakdown. Remember, this is just like a ratio of inter-industry transactions. So it can really only show you that ripple effect.
Thank you, Nadège. Yes, exactly. And just for clarification, it looks like someone was specifically interested in forward linkages and scope 1, 2, 3. If your original question was regarding just scope 1, 2, 3 in general, with our backward linkages models, yes, for those of you that don't know. You are able to measure scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. There is a great suite of environmental results that are
Hmm.
available. And we, again, have a number of support site articles and, in fact, past webinars covering both of those topics. So if, in general, using backward linkages, those are of interest to you, I recommend those. And as Nadège said, with forward linkages, not available yet, but it doesn't mean it's not coming.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So good. A little bit more of a theoretical question. What industries typically have the strongest forward linkages effects if this data has been collected? And why does IMPLAN's multiplier structure capture these differently than backward effects?
Okay. So Terry, I actually am not sure which industries have the strongest for linkage effects. That's actually a really good question, and I think we should look into that. But for your other question, why does IMPLAN's multiplier structure capture these differently than backward effect? So a funny thing you mentioned that. So the IMPLAN data structure is the same for both forward linkages and our backward linkage. The only difference is, and I don't want to get too technical, but the equation is the exact same. It's that other than you looking at the A matrix, which is the inter-industry, we're actually looking at the B matrix, which is still inter-industry, but rather than looking at rows, we're actually looking at columns in the matrices. That is, or in that particular matrix. That is really the only difference between backward and forward linkages. Um, it's called the gauche inverse rather than the Leontief inverse. So that's the reason why we're still able to like look in the future is because rather than looking at us as the final product, now we can see us as a particular ingredient in that supply chain process. So it's more of a because implant is a linear model, rather than looking at one perspective, we're just looking at a different perspective of the data, but the data hasn't changed. I hope I was able to answer that question though.
Thanks, Nadège. And I would say, to add on to that, that we don't, I haven't looked, full disclosure, I haven't dug into the data and I don't have, a data table to show you what has the largest forward linkage multipliers, but I do like to kind of lean back on intuition and think about, again, Nadège's beautiful starting point of a recipe, right? And an ingredient to a recipe. So remember, forward linkage impacts come from how many different recipes this commodity is an ingredient in. So when we think about things like maybe raw commodities or like soybeans or fruits or things that are not to rely on food just because my analogy is recipe, but those things that are raw inputs in a lot of different places, those are likely to have pretty have bigger forward linkage impacts. But again, this is just my back of the envelope intuition and not so much data based thought.
Thank you, Eric. And then we have an anonymous here. Eric, would you like to read that? Sorry.
Let's see. Um, yes, I come from the environmental nonprofit world, and in Emily's case, there is a cost to raise $1 to prove the grant maker slash funder. Does Emily's 100 million get eroded by the cost to raise the 100 million?
Mm. So that's actually outside of the implant model. That's not something that implant would be able to to calculate because implant assumes that the money is there for the grant already. So when Emily places her $100 million output in implant, implant assumes that the that she already has the money. That seems more of like a political question that could maybe be answered like through policy, but the model wouldn't know that, no.
Yeah. Thanks, Nadège. And it looks like we have a few more. These are great questions. A very
Yeah.
active bunch. Can I access county level data? Yes, you can use counties in both the cost push and downstream industry contribution guide. That's a mouthful for me apparently. But yes, those are available in those guides. I like that. A nice straightforward question for us to answer. Okay, next up. Um, if this, I don't fully appreciate how this set of output connects to IMPLAN's traditional direct and indirect output. So
Okay.
I think the question is about, um, you know, what do these direct and indirect output reflect in the forward linkage guides versus what they reflect with our traditional backward linkage models.
I s- okay, I see. Yeah, we would still call it, we might need to potentially name it something differently, but we would still call it direct and indirect effects because of again, when we think of indirect and direct effects, we think of, these ripple effects that go throughout the supply chain. So if you like have any other interesting names that you'd like, you can always email us at implan.com, support@implan.com, and we can potentially get a new name change. I don't know. Eric, do you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just that. I think that that's a good question. Direct output, that is, even in the forward linkage guide, you can see that that's the industry, that's the impact on the direct, either commodity related industry or the industry that we are specifying in the downstream industry contribution guide. So there is overlap there in terms of what we traditionally think about direct effects with the backward linkages. But, and this is something that we specify and point out in our forward linkage support site content also, when we think about indirect effects, there is a distinct difference between what our indirect effects are with forward linkages and what our indirect effects are looking at with backward linkages. And again, as Nadège said, we've had internal discussions about uh, if we should refer to these differently. The bottom line is that if you are putting together a 360-degree analysis and you're looking at backward linkages and you're looking at forward linkages, one, it's not appropriate to combine the indirect effects from the backward linkages and the indirect effects from the forward linkages. You should
Yeah.
specifically call out these as two distinct different things. Remember, one is looking in the backward linkages case backward at the supply chain. And that's where those indirect effects are coming from. In the forward linkage case, the indirect effects are coming from the complete opposite of the supply chain, right? And the end users of this product or commodity that we're looking at. So again, I know I sound like a broken record referring to it, mostly because we can't answer everything in great depth here, but I do recommend taking a look at the support site article because it helps, I think, draw this out a little bit more as well and reiterate that fact that these indirect impacts in forward linkages are distinct from the indirect impacts in backward linkages. Okay. Are there forward linkages evaluated by IMPLAN considering value added? So could I evaluate how a product or commodity contributes to value added of other industries?
Yeah. So right now, implant does include value added, but not in all of them. I believe it's in the cost push. So some of them, or if it's in the downstream, let me see. Yeah, it is. So it says contribution, direct contribution to GDP, we typically will state that that's our value added, and then we also have our value added. This is for the downstream contribution. So we do have our value added columns in the forward linkages as well. I hope I was able to answer your question there.
Thank you, Nadège.
Yes, of course.
Okay, just making sure the way I understood it was that the backward linkages in the Leontief model are analyzed column-wise, while forward linkages in the Gauche model are analyzed row-wise. I think I heard you say it the other way.
Oh,
Please reiterate.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, so we're talking about sectors. Final demand is typically rows, and the intermediate is typically columns. If I said it the other way around, I apologize. But we're looking at final demand, and that's typically the Gauche model is final demand, and that's between rows, and the Leontief is between columns.
Thank you, Nadège. In future versions, will you be able to combine commodities? For example, paper products are under several IMPLAN categories. If you ran it multiple times and added them together, you will likely double count. These industries often use each other.
So will we be able to combine commodities? I'm not sure. That's a question for product. I'm hoping that just like we can do, custom spending patterns for particular commodities and also industry aggregations, maybe in the future. But that's a question for product. Unless Eric, if you know any additional information.
Um, I do not have any special crystal ball or preview right now. No, you're right. That is a question for product, and we do have a development roadmap for forward linkages, and we are planning on expanding these. The guides are a great starting point for some straightforward use cases like this, but as Jeffrey points out in this question, there are a few, admittedly limitations, things like custom aggregations, combined regions, that sort of thing. Those are not yet implemented.
Mm-hmm.
And there is another question from Jeffrey as well. Does cost push changes increase both domestic and imported commodities?
Ooh, that is a good question. I actually am not quite sure um, for that one, but we can look into it and definitely get back to you on that. Eric, are you aware?
I will be honest that I am not exactly positive either. So Jeffrey, we'll look into that and get clarification for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And that looks like we had one other question that came in the chat rather than through the Q&A, which is fine. So is it possible to measure the impacts of electricity cost increases?
At the moment, no. What we can do though is again all the model can do because it's a linear model, it really only shows the reverberations within the supply chain. Those direct like energy costs, because that can change depending on region, that would have to be a specific problem that maybe you'll have to like maybe talk to a utilities, I don't know, a utility company and talk to them about that. But for now, we cannot model that, no. But again, so because this is our first iteration, IMPLAN's first iteration, we're hoping that further models we are able to do that. But for right now, no.
Yeah. And I will add that you can look at maybe some components, things like electrical power generation. Remember that the cost push guide starts from a commodity standpoint. So
Mm-hmm.
any commodity that you can model in IMPLAN, you can start from there, right? So, for example, our IMPLAN 3034 relates to electric power generation, hydroelectric power generation. 3042 relates to electricity transmission and distribution. So depending
Mhm.
on what aspect you're starting from, what your starting point is in the electricity provision and production, you could start from one of those commodity standpoints.
Yeah.
All right. This is good timing. We're pushing up on our 1 o'clock ending. So I want to say thank you all again for attending. Nadège, if you would forward your slides, we just have a few closing thoughts. First, if you've heard me say this enough already, but if you need additional resources, I highly recommend you check out the guides, or book a demo for the guides, or check out the details on our support site or previous webinars. All great places to fill in, where maybe we weren't able to answer your question today, or if things pop up afterwards and you want to look more into it, I suggest taking a look there. Uh,
Oh, sorry.
Forward,
And
no
um,
worries.
mhm.
If you are interested in seeing this in action and you don't have access to it, please reach out and book a demo. It is a lot of fun to play around with. I think it's one thing to see us do it here. It's another thing to hands-on use it, and see how straightforward and easy it is to put it into practice. So don't hesitate, reach out, book a demo, play around. And then if you have questions during your demo about your use case, let us know. And finally, any additional questions, reach out to support at IMPLAN. If you want to learn more about a subscription for IMPLAN, sales@implan.com, or ask the SAM bot for support 24/7. And finally, thank you all. These are a lot of fun for us. They are even more fun when everybody participates as you have today. So thank you so much. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Nadège, for your presentation today. We hope to hear from all of you again, and keep an eye out for our future webinars.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. And have a wonderful rest of your week.